Today I'm showing you my Whirlwind Barbarian build in Diablo IV. And honestly, this might be one of the strongest Barbarian builds I've played so far. This build is hitting for over 100 trillion damage, and sometimes even higher. The damage scaling becomes completely insane once everything starts stacking together. So first, let me show you the damage. These are the training dummies, and this is where the build really starts to shine. Once the Overpower stacks begin scaling, the damage numbers get ridiculous. We're hitting anywhere between 100 and 150 trillion damage. And the crazy part is that the build still feels smooth and tanky while doing it. Now let's test the build inside a high-tier pit. This is where Whirlwind really becomes unstoppable. The clear speed feels incredibly fast. Elite packs disappear almost instantly. Fury sustain feels amazing. And the berserking uptime is basically permanent. The build scales extremely hard through critical strike damage, overpower, and weapon swapping mechanics. Let's test the build against one of the hardest bosses in the game. This is where the damage scaling becomes completely absurd. Once all buffs activate together, the boss health starts melting immediately. The survivability is also incredibly strong, thanks to fury generation, defensive scaling, and constant pressure from Whirlwind. Now let me show you the build. For the helmet, I'm using Air of Perdition. The most important stats here are critical strike chance and lucky hit chance. This helps the build scale damage much more consistently. For the chest armor, we want strength, maximum resource, fury generation, and armor. The aspect I'm using here is Blood Boiling Aspect. This helps massively with overall damage scaling. The gloves are extremely important for damage. We want strength, vulnerable damage, and critical strike damage multiplier. For tempering, we're using damage per overpower stack. This is one of the strongest scaling mechanics in the build. For the pants, I'm using Earth Striker aspect. This gives us overpower stacks while weapon swapping. The extra damage scaling here is incredibly strong. The main stats are strength, fury, and armor. For the boots, we're using Battle Mad aspect. The important stats are strength, fury regeneration, and Warcry bonuses. Now let's talk about the most important part of the build, the two-handed mace. This weapon is absolutely insane. We want weapon damage, strength, critical strike damage, strength multiplier, and physical damage multipliers. The aspect here is Limitless Rage. This weapon carries a huge amount of the build's damage scaling. For the one-handed weapons, we're focusing heavily on critical strike damage multipliers. I'm also using Ramaladni's Magnum Opus, which works incredibly well with fury scaling. The aspect setup here helps push the damage even further. For the slashing weapon, I'm using a two-handed sword. You can also use a polearm or axe depending on preference. The important part is scaling critical strike damage and damage per overpower stack. The aspect I'm using here is Aspect of Channeling. One of my rings is honestly insanely lucky. We have critical strike chance, critical strike damage multiplier, and vulnerable damage multiplier. Combined with damage per overpower stack, the scaling becomes ridiculous. The aspect here is Crushing Aspect. I'm also using Ring of the Starless Skies, which massively helps with fury sustain and damage output. For the amulet, I'm using Melted Heart of Selig. This item helps a lot with survivability and resource generation. I'm also using the Bone Wave aspect from the new Diablo system, and the results feel incredibly strong. Now let's move into the Paragon boards. On the starting board, I'm using Challenger Glyph. This gives us massive damage against elites together with strong stat scaling. The elite damage bonus here is extremely valuable for high-end content. The second board is Warbringer. This is honestly one of the strongest Paragon boards right now. Here I'm using Wrath Glyph. This massively boosts critical strike damage scaling, which is one of the core mechanics of the build. Next, we have Blood Rage. This board heavily boosts berserking damage. Combined with Twister Glyph, the Whirlwind Tornado damage becomes incredibly powerful. Then we move into Weapon Master. This board gives fury while swapping weapons and increases damage against injured enemies. Here I'm using Might Glyph for even more damage scaling. And finally, Flawless Technique. This board gives huge critical strike bonuses. The glyph I'm using